Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for you today, as you can tell by the fact that I'm stealing Sagar's lines. Sagar is out today, but we have the amazing Rachel Bovard virtually in the house to help me host the show today. Great to have you back again, Rachel.
Great to be here.
So in the show today, we've got a great panel. We've got Ryan Grimm talking about what Mitch McConnell's game in all of this stimulus relief negotiations has been. We've got Greg Bluestein on. He's that fantastic reporter we've had on before from Georgia to break down what's going on in those key Senate races. But we wanted to start with some actually good breaking news that unfolded yesterday evening, which is that the House actually passed by a 2/3 majority $2,000 checks. That was what the president has been requesting. It's an interesting coalition here of every Democrat save for two and a chunk of 44 Republicans. You had 44 Republicans voting yes, 130 voting no, going against the president on these $2,000 checks. But pretty interesting dynamics here, Rachel. What did you make of the number of the Republicans on the breakdown here? Because I sort of feel like there's two ways you can look at it. On the one hand, you could say, wow, that's a lot of Republicans that just bucked the president. On the other hand, you could say, wow, 44 Republicans just voted for $2,000 checks to go directly to the American people, something that really would have been unheard of just a few years ago.
Yeah, it definitely is a narrative shift for Republicans, I think brought on by the fact that, again, you're still dealing with a crisis that people really haven't made, right? This is a crisis not of their own making, of their own choosing. But a couple of things I want to say about what the Republicans did here, and I think explain a little bit of the thinking behind some of the Republicans who voted no and why. Because what I thought was really interesting was you had members of the House Freedom Caucus, and in particular, I'm thinking of Congressman Ken Buck from Colorado, come out and say, hey, I actually support the $2,000. I want to give this to American workers. I think they need it. You know, families are struggling, but I'm not comfortable doing it on top of the rest of this bloated spending. So if we can get cuts in other places, and he outlined a few areas where he thought that could happen, I would be in favor of these checks. Now, he was one of the no votes yesterday because he didn't see that sort of offsetted, corollaries that he asked for. But I do think it represents a shift in thinking for some Republicans. Now, you're always going to have the people, like Mitt Romney, who are like, well, we can't give free money to American workers, but hey, let's give it to corporations. But I think you're starting to see Republicans recognize the prioritization that has to take place, and they are willing to engage in that debate. They didn't see what they wanted to see in the prioritization yesterday, but you saw Republicans come to the table both rhetorically and then, as you pointed out, some of them actually voting in favor in ways that we haven't seen before. So I think that shift is interesting.
I mean, what we always see, though, is that when it's defense industry CEOs who send a letter to Congress and 3 days later they get their priorities in the bill, when it's industry, when it's business, they all jump too. And suddenly, when it's money going directly to the American people, oh, the deficit, the debt, we've really got to worry. And you had some, and we can throw up on the screen, these are all the list of people who voted against in the House this $2,000 check. This is, in my view, the wall of shame. People who, were happy again to go along with corporate priorities. Probably many of these folks support the corporate liability shield, for example. We can move through these names. And again, only 2 Democrats actually voting against this, which to me was a surprisingly small number. One of them, Dan Lipinski, has already been primaried out of his seat, so he will no longer be there in the next Congress. The other one, Kurt Schrader, had, a typical deficit hawk mindset around, oh, it's just too much money and it's not properly targeted. So those are the list of people who ultimately voted against this. And maybe you had some people who had some better reasons, but you also had some people who had some really bad reasons for voting against this $2,000. Let's take a listen to Congressman Kevin Brady, explaining why he thought these checks should not go out.
This won't help local restaurants get their workers permanently back, or hospitality and convention industries rehire their workers for the long term, and won't help get energy workers back on the job. Will this stimulate our local economies? Not a lot. What we know is that much of this extra $1,600 will go to pay down credit card debt, or savings, or even make new purchases online at Walmart, Best Buy, or Amazon.
So that we pay down credit card debt or have savings. Can't have that in America.
Yeah, I'm not an economist, but I do think paying down debt's pretty good. I think stimulating the economy through purchases can't hurt. But hey, maybe like Larry Summers said, it's going to, overstimulate, overinflate, overheat the economy. But I think Kevin Brady's, representing a singular type of viewpoint, which is, some Republicans genuinely believe that the best stimulus you can give people is a job. I tend to think there's some Republicans who see both as important, right? Payments in time of crisis and also access to work and employment. But, and there's some Republicans that very much believe we do need to open the economy faster than we are, and that's the best stimulus. But to the point I think a lot of people have made, you have to do something that bridges that gap. States aren't open. Jobs, employment isn't available to everybody. So what do you do in the meantime? And that, I think, was what was really at issue here. And you saw a lot of Republicans, I think, not willing to acknowledge that point.
Yeah, well, and they're between a rock and a hard place because on the one hand, you have Donald Trump, who is extraordinarily popular with the Republican base and still has a lot of power there, who's on the side of the $2,000 checks. You have an American public that, probably 80%, somewhere 70, 80% also support this direct stimulus payment because it's been so long since they've gotten any help from the federal government whatsoever. I mean, this is long overdue in terms of helping Americans to close the hole. And then for people who have this, traditional Reaganite libertarian economic perspective, they also have an issue on their hands where actually people could see that the federal government was able to help. I mean, the first CARES Act, even though the way it was structured was insufficient and was tilted towards the big players and all of those things, you saw when people got that unemployment plus up and they got that first $1,200 check and unemployment was expanded to gig workers and people who normally don't have access to it, it had a measurable impact on the economy. So this talking point, this traditional libertarian talking point of all the government can do is screw things up and they really can't help your life. The best thing for them to do is get out of the way. That's kind of blown out of the water. And the American people are very much siding on the side of, no, actually, we need the government. We want the government to do something in the breach here.
Yeah, it kind of goes against this, what I think is actually a contorted libertarian talking point, which is that the government should never exist, right? The best government is no government. That's an overstatement because no one actually, the forefathers of libertarian thought didn't actually think that, right? Friedrich Hayek, who, was the great articulator of limited government, actually said there are times when the government should act. And one of those is in a crisis. One of those is to protect the free market, against monopolies, all of these things. And so I think you're seeing that right now. And you're seeing the tension, I think, that exists around a Republican Party that has constructed itself around, as you point out, this narrative that the government is always bad, full stop. And again, I actually do think limited government has value. I think, big business scares me. Big government also scares me. And so I think that skepticism is healthy. But I don't think it's a rational narrative or one that's particularly useful at all in our modern politics to say no government ever, always bad. It's reductive. And I think in cases like this, it's actually harmful because you're dealing with, hopefully a once in a several decade pandemic. This is the time for the government to step up and say, what is it that we need to do to get people, to a functioning economy? Then maybe we can step off the gas, and that may be where we disagree. But, getting people to the point is important.
Well, it's penny wise and pound foolish is the point that you're making, right? Because you're going to pay for it many times over if you don't help people through this time. You're going to cause the kind of permanent damage to the economy that is much more expensive, if that's your metric, to recover from ultimately. So the question is where things go now from here. So the House has passed the $2,000 checks. Is the Senate ultimately going to take it up? President Trump, when he signed the relief bill, seemed to indicate that he had some deal with the Senate, that they were going to take a vote on this. Mitch McConnell hasn't said anything, at least as of the time that we are taping this morning. So one person who stood up and is going to try his best to force action in what I think is a very clever maneuver is Bernie Sanders, who has said, so these two pieces are tied together. We're going to talk more about this in the next segment, but Bernie Sanders has said he is not going to go along with unanimous consent on the defense funding bill until there is a vote on the $2,000 direct payment. So what does that mean? Look, it doesn't mean he's able to block the defense funding bill altogether. It just means that he's able to extend the process and critically to force senators to have to stay in Washington over the New Year's holiday, something that they desperately do not want to do. So he is definitely pushing on the gas, trying to force a vote here. You have a few Republicans, Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, who have come out and in support of these $2,000 checks. Mitch McConnell's in kind of a tough place because he doesn't really want to pass these $2,000 checks. He doesn't know how his caucus is ultimately going to split on them. Unclear whether there would be the 60 votes in the Senate to get these things through and give the president what he ultimately wants here. And at the same time, he's putting his two Georgia senators who are on the ballot in January in a very tough spot. What do you make of all these dynamics, Rachel, and what do you think is going to happen here?
Well, I think, objecting to the process going forward, because again, the Senate takes a long time to do anything. And so they're always trying to get to consent on these things. So that's what Senator Sanders is talking about, saying, no, you don't get my consent to collapse the time. You're going to have to be here, run time on all this stuff. And it actually is a really strong point of leverage because, as we know from the Senate, the one thing they hate to do the most is work on anything. And so forcing them to actually stick around, you can actually get things done. You can make your point. But what's interesting to me about this is, in saying to Mitch McConnell, hey, I cut this deal. When Trump said this to McConnell that, he's going to put these votes on the floor, this is going to happen. He's making, again, what I've said for years now is a critical error of his presidency, which is trusting Mitch McConnell on anything. There needs to be a significant point of tension to Trump to McConnell if he expects to get anything done on this point, because I don't think McConnell has any plans to do this. Look, Trump thinks he's getting votes on the $2,000 checks, on Section 230 repeal or reform, and then something on election fraud investigations. Mitch McConnell's statement said none of that, and Trump's statement is the one that said it. So again, you have a huge divide, I think, between where Trump and McConnell are. So it's going to take actions like Senator Sanders objecting, and that's not his only power here. He has a lot more power. Unclear if he's going to use it, but it's going to take action from him and other senators to force this vote if it's something they really want.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting here, Rachel, is this is sort of like, this moment is almost like an alternative history of the Trump administration in which, there were more moments where he was actually siding with the economic populists in the Democratic Party over his own party and just as hard on Mitch McConnell as he is on Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. That ended up not being the administration that ultimately unfolded. So it's kind of interesting that here, right at the end of his term, after he's been bounced out of office, he's doing something that I think a lot of people in this overlap between him and Sanders, and by the way, I think, just to put a caveat on this, if he had been pushing for these checks a long time ago, they already could have gone out the door, so he hasn't been a good actor in all of this. But this overlap between him and Bernie Sanders is, I think, a potential, alternative history of his administration, something that a lot of people would have liked to have seen throughout his entire term.
Yeah, this is truly the story of what could have been, I think, for the Trump administration, and just pressure on the Senate in general. Right? Like, even if you don't agree on some of these issues, the $2,000 checks, whatever, the Senate has blown off Trump on so many areas in refusing to even consider the priorities that he wanted or consider the priorities that were important to any number of his members. And you're never going to hear me criticize the Senate voting. Voting is the only accountability that we have to look at, to see where these people stand. And President Trump has allowed Mitch McConnell to keep his members dry, right? To never force them to take difficult positions. It's an incumbent protection racket, and it's how Mitch McConnell runs the Senate. Trump could have, forced, I think, a lot of these issues on any number of questions, and he just chose not to. He showed a remarkable amount of deference to Mitch McConnell, who, from the beginning, told Trump, I don't want to hear any more of this drain the swamp talk. This was a guy who was never really supportive of the Trump agenda, and Trump gave him way too much deference. So, yes, this is the story of what could have been. I guess it's fine for a last hurrah, but we could have seen a very different 4 years.
Well, and we should be really clear that I think at this point, if you had to bet, you'd say still unlikely that $2,000 checks go out. But it's gotten a lot more interesting just over the course of the past day. All right, Rachel, stick with us, and I'm going to tell you what's on my radar. That is next.